So here we're back again today. I'm sorry I stopped making videos for about 2 weeks. Today we go back on a topic that I think is very important and that I find very hotly debated on the internet. And I'm referring to the so-called encastellation. You know, that phase of the European High Middle Ages, in which castles and other forms of fortifications widely spread in the in the landscape, coming to eventually characterize in a way the the same the idea of Middle Ages that we have today, because the castle is obviously the symbol of the Middle Ages, I believe, more than the knight, more than partly because obviously much of these works of fortifications actually remained. Some of them were eventually developed, and we still have our Europe dotted with all these um, structures that we say, oh look, that's the Middle Ages, that's medieval history. And in specific, I would like to talk today about the encapsulation relatively to the redistribution of powers. Once again, in this period of post-Carolingian times that I already discussed in other videos, that I find very, very interesting and very crucial for its importance um, for Western history. Um, and I would like to start about especially the allodial ownings. That is basically those domains that were given in full property by public authority. Um, sometimes things were a bit more complex. Um, but let's say that because, for instance, the the these properties could actually be given. These allodia could be given, could be actually sanctioned as such when certain lords had already entered in possession of that specific property. But we find that since the Carolingian age proper, so the moment in which, theoretically speaking, public authority in the West was still strong, um, we find the Carolingian Empire, Carolingian kings eventually, in which the empire was fragmented in the various Carolingian branches, to some clergymen, so some ecclesiastical powers, as well as like um, powers, as an allodium. Mm? Allodium means a property that is a domain that is given in full property. Mm? It has, etymologically speaking, a High Germanic origin from al, which it's like in English, it's all, and od, which means good. So you kind of have it, you have this good in everything, every part of it. And I think it's very important to stress the difference between an allodium and let's say sort of mandate as a functionary. Mm? Because originally speaking, what was given by the Carolingian kings, even in fief, um, was was essentially something that had eventually to come back to the king, because it was the king's property. Mm? So it was a temporaneous concession according to the feudal or beneficiary, how you want to call it, relationship. Mm? And therefore it's quite meaningful that at a certain point the same public authority decides to alienate from itself those goods and to give them in full property to someone else. Um, I've already been speaking in the past about why this actually occurred. Probably we'll come back more specifically in another video. What we are stressing now is just to understand what's the nature of the allodium. Not much, because it comes this shift. Um, and, um, and however, one of the reasons why this was being done relatively to the nature of the contract, let's say, in itself, was that obviously the allodium was much more you know, convenient and and obviously preferable for someone to have than a good that had eventually to come back into someone else's hands. And therefore, paradoxically, it was during the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, in certain situations it was much more convenient for public authority to strengthen the relationship with some lords by giving them some goods that became fully their own, rather than, you know, saying, well, but that's something that eventually has to come back to me. Because obviously that lord would be more thankful to you as a king for having done such a thing. And by the way, the fact that that allodium was had been given to you by the king was an extremely important confirmation in a way, meaning that it's not an allodium that becomes yours because now it's yours and it doesn't matter how you came in the process of it, but it's yours because the king has given it to you. Therefore, no one else can take it away from you, if not going against the king's will. And obviously, this doesn't mean that historically, you know, the kings maybe didn't didn't change their minds and even try to recover their Allodia, or they eventually they eventually confirmed the de facto passage of property through wars and other stuff of these properties from a lord to another. But it's still very meaningful because it was a way, as a result, even to make these lords co-participate to public authority, also because to these Allodia, so to this property, were attached many rights and privileges that originally were basically of public pertinence. So that was extremely important. And going back to the Encastellation, why all this thing about the Allodia? Because very often these Allodia were made up of castles, of fortifications. These castles originally weren't much of a thing. I mean, we know that the stone walls and permanent fortresses were actually developed from the low Middle Ages onwards. So this time we find these, they're called castra essentially, and they were motte and bailey, or or even less than that. But they were still very meaningful at that time, because eventually the Carolingian Empire disgregates. There aren't many big powers at that point who can you know, create very big armies, and therefore even a small castle with, you know, a palisade and maybe a ditch could basically fence off, um, or at least to keep busy many most of the enemies you could face. It was a very um, varied kind of range of dimensions and obviously also of locations, because normally these castles were built where there was a sort of need of that, and we will be talking about that in a while, because that's kind of the heart of this video. And therefore these castles could first of all either be created on demand, meaning the king could say, I have this castle, now I pass it to you as an allodium, so as long as you're faithful to me, and obviously otherwise you in theory lose this allodium. Or I'm not even sure much about that, but obviously royal power was the only capable of requiring it back, of demanding it back in a way. Otherwise, which happened quite often as well, it could happen that some local lords had already built castles on their own, without even asking for the king's permission. And in that case, it could happen that the king said, okay, fine, build that castle. Theoretically speaking, you ought not to have done that because I gave you no permission, but, that's yours, and I confirm you that. So I legitimate it, and you're tied to me now because I am the king, and you have my assent. Um, and what I find mostly interesting about this process, obviously, it's a very broad topic. I mean, talking about how castles developed in Europe, it's such a big topic. But what I find very hotly debated on the internet is why these castles were built. Back in certain up to certain some tens of years ago, the historiographical tendency was saying, well, why were these castles during the 8th, the 9th, and 10th, and 11th century were built? Because these were there were moments of high instability. There were a lot of wars, there were a lot of invasions, and there was a great fragmentation of political power. Therefore, the importance of these castles is probably strictly related to the fear of communities of sudden attacks, and therefore they represent a sort of broad defensive strategy against the enemy that you find scattered all over Europe. But in the last decades, we have seen that this is not really true. It is true, of course, to a certain extent. There is no doubt that many castles were built because of Norman, Saracen, or Hungarian invasions, and we have no doubt that this ever took place. However, it seems that a very large part of these castles, and possibly even the majority of them, which is much more likely than what is often believed, were not really built because they were a defensive element. I mean, tactically speaking, they were surely, something that brings to defense. You close yourself into the castle and you can shield yourself from the enemies. But strategically speaking, and more broadly politically speaking, what emerged from research is that these castles were actually built in a sort of offensive measure. Meaning what? Meaning that some lords that wanted to expand in these years, because obviously public power was very weak, and they had the means and they had the ambitions to build their own power, they decided to make castles a part of project of construction of local powers and of extending their dominions. So you don't build a castle necessarily because the Normans or the Saracens and the Hungars arrive, but you build a castle because you wanna maybe control an area on which you wanna expand, or because you wanna compete with your neighbor lord, and you wanna expand. And you have to think obviously that the only people who could make these castles built were lords, and lords who had more than a substantial quantity of um, of resources to spend. Naturally, we have to think that most of these castra, in actual fact, weren't much more than actually fortified villages all over Europe. So maybe they could have a very varied nature in terms of their genesis. It could also be that it was the lord building up these fortifications together with local peasantry or even small towns. It doesn't have necessarily to be just the lords. But what is evident is that it's not mainly a strategical reason, and there are actually many reasons for this. First of all, think that when you are invaded, most of the times, the economical situation is not very good. Hmm? So you can obviously make some attempt to defend yourself, but you're not gonna necessarily make it to build in time a fortress. Or maybe you simply don't have the resources because the enemies have laid waste your territories, and you don't even have the material to actually start up a construction like that. So what you actually see, and there is a beautiful study of Toubert about, for instance, medieval Latium, so the region of Rome, is that the the Encastellation was started in that area only when the Saracen raids had been stopped, and all the castles that started popping out along the Roman countryside in that period were built by local lords who wanted to compete with each other because they finally had a situation of stability and availability of resources, and could make plans to not only build castles of their own but also razing to the ground the ones of their competitors. And it's also and this is also a very good explanation overall, because you see that between the 9th and 10th centuries, what kind of castles survive? Because we have seen that not all castles survived. There were small things after all, and many of them were razed to the ground. So can there be a tendency that can be traced in any way relatively to the causes for which certain castles survived and eventually even made it to the low Middle Ages, where when they were reinforced and restructured and rebuilt, and maybe they have even arrived up to our days? Yes, because it emerges that the areas where the castles survived the most, it might sound banal, but so it's not, is that it's those areas that were relatively rich and that had not suffered plunder, they had not suffered devastations, and where the lords had actually in fact a lot of agrarian production and potential, to invest for these structures. Other castra that were actually instead built because of a strictly defensive reason, because maybe some invader was arriving. They were actually very temporary ones. I mean, there was an enemy who was gonna attack you, and you were already making your plans by building castles for other reasons. All of a sudden, a new enemy arrives. So what you do is that uh, you might even have less resources at that time and build a safety castle in a very strategic location that allows you to defend better your lands. But it's an emergency measure, and eventually the raids stop after more or less long time, and that custom gets lost. Um, so the picture that we get from here is that all these constructions were mostly built not, seemingly not, at least for because of the second invasions, but for processes that really have to do with the inner politics and local dynamics that were taking place within Europe itself, aside from the second invasions. And this is very often debated because people have sometimes even ideological reasons for saying things like, as Europeans we were aggressed at the time and therefore the castles witness our resistance and stuff because, yeah, we made it. Yeah, I mean, in a certain measure you can argue that overall the Encastellation was partly because of that, but if you really care about European history, I think it's much more important to actually show how developed were the countrysides and Europe in general, even in that moment of supposed darkness of or political weakness. You find local powers that not only have to defend from the enemies, but have also resources and ambitions and can build castles to expand. And this gives you a much more powerful picture of the European landscape at the time. Because and this is also important, you also have to think about the productivity in this sense, where these castles were built. They were usually built to dominate fertile lands, fertile areas that incidentally weren't the ones where it was more profitable to stop an enemy. Why? Because normal fertile lands are open grounds. They aren't really fit for building a defensive structure. Therefore, if you want to block an enemy, you usually do it on a mountain pass or on a river or somewhere else that maybe doesn't have that um, agricultural potential that a very open ground can really have. And therefore, when those emergency castles were built to stop the enemies, and the enemies stopped attacking, there was no point of keeping castles there because they were usually unfertile places, hostile places on the mountains. We wanted to go there. It's much better to have a castle on flat land and to dominate a huge area from there. Usually, the mountain environments weren't that rich compared to other lowland areas. Um, and, um, um, and it's very interesting how, ideologically speaking, the allodium is used. Because we have seen how in different ways the allodium can actually be obtained. From one side were people really, there were lords building castles and basically getting them as in full property because they'll build them. And yeah, eventually maybe public authority could say, yeah, you have them, but they basically had built that on their own. Some other times, the same kings passed their own castles to those lords, and these lords had a very doppelganger um, attitude, because from one side they were quite, you know, they obviously wanted to show that their castles and their Allodia were um, had been given to them by public authority. It was a huge prestige to say, look at this castle, it's the king that has given it to me. It's a great, it's a great, it's a very powerful thing. The idea that you have something that public authority legitimates you in its possession. Um, from the other side, it was a different form of pride that actually stemmed from the idea that that castle, that property, was your own um, as a family property. Mhm. This is the period after the Carolingian Empire when the where the origins of feudal lineages were lineage in French were starting. So what were these guys? Were families of people of various origins. We will talk about that in a while. That had started gaining power for a reason or another, and obviously they felt themselves as important in that context, because there wasn't much of a social stratification, and therefore the only ones who were emerging at that time and were instead contributing to increasingly to the stratification of society obviously wanted to justify the preeminence of their family on the other people. Feudalism starts in this way, obviously in a very simplified way. Society, technically speaking, was already stratified. It was always stratified, but this is the moment in which feudalism pushes this um, to very concrete consequences, and therefore these families who emerged felt themselves as like the coolest guys around, and that's where the idea of nobility actually stems. So these Allodia and these castles were the symbol both of a public authority that was theoretically still there and a private authority that instead was made of blood, we can say, the blood of a family. And we can say that obviously these families were guided in a way by the same Carolingian system to emerge. Especially in Germany and France, these are the regions of Europe in which we find um, the earliest affirmation of family lineages that were of the highest rank, that they had very often ties with the royal family, and that in that sense, in the name um, of a of a royal power that was conferred in part to them, they were given lands and power, and these are the kingdoms, in fact, in which um, feudalism would be let's say the strongest in these years, but not really in a positive sense, meaning that both France and Germany were actually in post-Carolingian times quite weak entities, meaning that France was, yeah, there was a king theoretically, but he had a very small power. French monarchy would strengthen up dramatically only after the end of the 10th century. Even in Germany, where we find paradoxically that the feudal system um, had brought to, let's say, Germany as a kingdom had better survived in terms of political integrity, and this is shown by the Saxon dynasty of the Ottonians, who actually even renovated the empire by trying to reunite Germany and Italy at once, weren't actually much in actual power everywhere. Um, Say that the Saxons, the Ottonians had a significant power in Saxony and in Franconia, but there were other areas of Germany who were de facto quite autonomous, and even Italy was taken afterwards. Actually, was controllable with a very great difficulty by the Saxons. So, all in all, however, we see that in these two kingdoms, um, the most powerful European people, European families, noble families emerge. Because there is a bit more of a continuity with royal public authority, even with all its weaknesses in some times, and they were of highest ranks. Italy, instead, being the the third kingdom for importance of the post-Carolingian areas, had a very different organization, because Italy had a much more. I mean, it's difficult to explain, but let's say that, for instance, in France, there were already very large estates that could be controlled traditionally by a single nobleman. Italy didn't have large estates, um, because people were very wealthy at a medium level. Um, France was richer than Italy in absolute terms, but Italians were richer than the French in average terms. And therefore, there wasn't in Italy a leading faction that could say, we are actually the most powerful families. Obviously, also Italy had very powerful noble families, but let's say that their ability to control the Italian kingdom was very difficult. They had a very regional characterization since the beginning, and they were much more unstable. And what really emerged in Italy was instead um, a different kind of family that was normally poorer compared to the French or German ones, and that had a different origin. That they came from those counts that had been put from the Carolingians in office, let's say, in Italy. Um, and another reason for this is that Italy was a kingdom of cities already by that time. And the cities were many. Therefore, Carolingian authority, after the Frankish conquest of the Longobard kingdom, had settled into cities, um, and not but they didn't these let's say that these families that had been settled there didn't have large estates. At least their estates weren't so large as those in France and in Germany, even though they were expanded from Longobard times after the Frankish conquest. And this is very important because the origins of these families became to be much more tied to local families that were usually much poorer. mm, and they came more often from relatively nowhere, in many ways. Um, and the mm, the proliferation of these castles that eventually were built everywhere in all of these European regions brought to the definitive development of those so-called um, comitati, um, or marquisats, let's say, marquisates, that had origin in the in the Carolingian administration, but even in late antique administration, and that usually proceeded together alongside the actual administrative repartitions of these countries, and that usually had one or more castles to to represent them in a way. Obviously, the relative counts and marquises they started as very autonomous entities on their own, and they became even more autonomous after the fall of the Carolingian Empire. And let's say that the um, Encastellation process actually started from these repartitions, meaning that if you have a comitatus that is a district, you start as a count, as a comes in Latin, to build castles within that comitatus, territorially speaking, and therefore usually these castle building and pianification starts from these original territorial repartitions that already have, by the way, some form of strategical rationality, obviously. And maybe they had already developed as territories of frontiers. Think of the marquisates, the marks better, because the marquisates it's later in below the Middle Ages. The marks were normally created, even sometimes ex novo, in regions that were already heavily militarized, because they were frontier regions, for instance. And therefore, you see how much continuity there actually is when talking even about the early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages and even Low Middle Ages, because the places were actually the same, and even geography actually imposed much from this point of view. And obviously, in this process of encapsulation, there is always, however, a sort of public authority in the persons of the kings. In Italy, Germany, and from the 30s of the 11th century in Burgundy, it was the emperor, the first person that actually ruled, because those were the lands that would make the Holy Roman Empire. And obviously the imperial crown, as we know, was his, who owned, who was king of Italy, and there was a lot of infight for Italy for this, a lot of competition. For the simple reason that the king of Italy was the one who had the responsibility of the protection of the Church of Rome. Never forget about Rome in all this. We didn't talk it. We didn't say that much, but Rome really does a lot in all this process. We will maybe talk about it in another video. And therefore we can say that from the half of the 10th century, the great German characters were therefore emperors only because they were kings of Italy. It was just a title. As I was mentioning, for the Saxons, for the Ottonians, I mean, they didn't own everything, but it was enough to control Italy, at least formally, to say, okay, you're emperor. Obviously the Ottonians made much to rebuild the Carolingian grandeur and power, in order to justify their renewed empire and legitimating their own public authority. So I hope it was interesting about the Encastellation. Sorry for my voice, but I spent um, some weeks in hell. Therefore, I came here talking about these things like a sort of a relaxing moment. And I think the Encastellation is very, very, very important if you want to understand really medieval history, but not much because of, in fact, the reason why we we get interested about castles today, but more because of what you can discover when you you study about encapsulation and how much it can serve to understand how complex things were really back then. You can't listen to people saying, "Oh, castles were built because there were the invasions." No, at least certain areas of Europe didn't see encapsulation like mainly caused by that, and it's even possible that it was actually one of the least important reasons overall. Obviously, there were areas that were more exposed. It's obvious that if you think about Germany, for instance, along the Elbe River, you'll find that there was a frontier against the pagan Slavs, and those were had been frontiers for centuries, and therefore there were already castles built there from who knew from when, I mean from previous centuries. There were other areas in which instead castles started popping out, not because there was an imminent threat of sorts, but because they were and there was a lot of wealth and people and maybe in the presence um, of a weak public authority, these castles actually were much more of an entrepreneurial um, um, you know mm, element of exchange, even of good, and then actually a defensive work against invasions. And I think that in particular, well, they're both fascinating cases. Huh? And another thing, I don't know, I might even dedicate another video completely about it, is talking a bit more about the relationship that we've been talking about, the, let's say, administrative repartitions within the territory and the building of castles from a strategical point of view. Meaning what? That, I know, if I am a Duke of Bavaria, for instance, or uh, the Marquis of Verona, um, I I have a certain power, and I want to build castles in a broader picture. I don't want to build a castle a bit here, a bit there, but I want to build a net of fortifications to support my strategical ambitions to deal um, with my neighbors, eventually to become maybe emperor. And at the same time, it's very interesting to see it in proportion from a count's perspective. Counts that take what happened in France, for instance, were really on the rise. We're building very compact and powerful territorial entities that I will sure discuss. And therefore, it's interesting to see how they started from a very few thing and eventually became something greater. Even the same Ottonians in Germany actually rose from very humble origins. Mm? The very ancestors of the Saxons, of the Ottonians, sorry, were almost unknown Carolingian counts that had intermarried with local Saxon nobility, even with Widukind. And this, for instance, for the Ottonians was a bit of a problem in propaganda terms because they were the perfect example of someone rising from relatively humble origins and not, you know, and this didn't make you very, um, uh, very you know, prestigious in the face instead of other local families that were maybe originally very important. Because if you take France, take the kingdom of Burgundy, well, in there were families were extremely ancient and that could trace their origin from the Gallo-Roman times, at the time when the Germanic Burgundian aristocracy had intermarried with the Gallo-Roman aristocracy. And it's interesting, incidentally, because this happens a bit of all the times in history, is that paradoxically there were and naturally much newer lineages that rose to power from much obscure origins than very ancient and very ancient families who instead were declining. And some made it even through the low Middle Ages. If you take the Habsburgs, for example, well, the Habsburgs rose to a very important power, especially at the end of the 13th century, um, from a relatively small position. But the Habsburgs could seemingly, I say, trace their family origins from very, very ancient times, even from late antique times, from Burgundian and Gallo-Roman aristocracies. So I think it's very interesting even to think at the continuity of certain political experiments and to think at how these families were able to adapt to new scenarios and how they played their political cards, even relatively to their past, obviously, because also propaganda is very, very important. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I don't know whether I will make soon another one. I will go into vacations very soon, so I don't think I will have the time to do anything like that. But I will try maybe before leaving to make another video. The greatest favor you can do to me is to share this video if you think that I have to rise as a YouTuber. I love to talk about history now. I kind of got stuck to the Middle Ages, but I can talk about many interesting facts. I mean, if you deem them to be interesting, about old times in history. And if you have, please, any question about these videos, or even just a request, please feel free to ask, and feel free to subscribe and share this video. Have a nice one.